Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the podcast. I'm Nick and I'm thrilled you're listening. If you're a family ministry leader, children's pastor, youth pastor, next gen, or family pastor, or your job is somewhere in one of those three camps, this podcast is for you. And today, in this interview, I have something I know you're going to like. I mean, how many of us have asked the question, do we have enough staff? Do we have enough volunteers? Do we have enough budget? In fact, it probably doesn't work that way. It probably is more like, I don't have enough staff. I don't have enough volunteers. I don't have enough budget. And usually we're basing that off of our gut feeling. I mean, some churches you have some benchmarks or standards or ratios that you follow, but a lot of churches don't. And so we just base it off how we feel, how it's functioning. And I think what's great about Ministry Architects is they've worked with tons of churches, and so they've developed some benchmarks that are really helpful. We're going to talk through those. But before we jump into the interview, there's something I'd really love your help with. I actually see this question asked all the time in Facebook groups and in conferences and things like that. You know, the question of how many staff do you have versus how many kids or how many students do you have? And so I want to hold a survey that will ask just that. And so I'd love to get your input on that survey, so much so that I'm going to bribe you. Yes, I'm not above bribing you. And so if you just go to my website, nickblevins.com, you'll see a post there about children's and youth ministry ratios. And there's a survey in there you can take. And all you're going to do is provide some information about your church. And then if you can put information in there about your children's ministry and your youth ministry, that would be helpful. But if you can only do one or the other, that's fine too. And then for everybody that does that, you'll be entered to win one of 25 prizes that I'm giving away worth almost $2,500. And there's a bunch of great stuff in there. One of them will be a registration to the Orange Conference 2017. I'll be at the Orange Conference, and you can be there too if you win that. Another one will be a registration to the brand new Kidmin Nation Mega Conference happening in September 2017. Giving away 5 memberships to Inner Circle. It's coaching with Ryan Frank. So if you're in children's ministry, that'd be helpful to you. Ministry Architects actually has a diagnostic, kind of a way to evaluate your ministry. They have a tool for that. I'm giving away 10 of those thanks to the team at Ministry Architects. And some of those, they're children's ministry ones and they're youth ministry ones, and they all come with some free coaching, a free coaching call from Ministry Architects. So you'll love that too. And then in addition to that, some Amazon gift cards, Starbucks gift cards, just lots of stuff. Because like I said, again, I'm not above bribing. So I would love for you to take some time. Maybe you got to email yourself a reminder or something if you're listening to this on the road or if you're working out or something like that. And I'd love for you to fill out the survey and share it with friends too, to share it with people on social media, email people, whoever you can, because the goal is to get hundreds and hundreds of responses so that, and I'm nerding out here a little bit statistically, but so that we have a really good base so that the data is strong. You know, if only 20 people fill out the survey or something, then it's hard to really use it well. But if hundreds of us fill it out, then we can even break it down in terms of church size and church type. What does your programming look like? Are you multi-site or not? And so that'd be really helpful. So I'd love it if you take time to fill out that survey. You will have to get some of those numbers together, particularly attendance for your church, for kids and students, staffing, and volunteer numbers. You'll need those numbers to take the survey. But you can do that. Just go to nickblevins.com, look for that post. We'll also link to it in the show notes for this episode. And that's nickblevins.com/episode 28. Thanks for your help with the survey in advance. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see the results. I've done this before, but we should have a lot more responses this time. And last time I didn't include youth ministry. So it'd be really cool to see both those things. But I know what you want. You want to hear this interview. So let's go ahead and jump into my interview with Anthony Prince. Today I'm joined by Anthony Prince. Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good to be here, buddy.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your church, New Hope.
Yeah, so I'm Anthony Prince. I have been working in youth, children, family ministry for about 16 years. Married to my wife, Christine, for 10 of those. We have 3 kids. Carter and Kate are in elementary school. Our youngest, Vaughn, is in preschool this year. And 6 months ago, our family kind of packed up all our things together and moved from one coast of the country to the other. I had been on staff at a church, big church outside of Los Angeles for the last decade. but just began my role as family ministries pastor at New Hope Church out here in North Carolina about 6 months ago. New Hope's multi-site church. We got 10 campuses across the Carolinas, one in Kenya. And in my role, I get to be the architect for the way that we care for families and kids, cradle to college, across the movement, overseeing both the children's and the youth ministry teams over all of our campuses.
And that's really cool, but we know you moved out to the East Coast for the weather, right? Like you couldn't stand that awesome, great, West Coast, Southern California weather. You needed some cold, some change, some more seasons, right?
Yeah, I had this moment where I looked in my closet after the move and went, I have all of the wrong clothes. I have lived in California my whole life, and apparently, same country, different weather. Who knew?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can use those clothes at some times during some months, just not during others. Yeah, so you're probably going to have to go shopping, and that's coming up here soon because it's fall now. So.
And there's this thing called rain out here on the East Coast. Like we stopped having that in California a while ago. So that's also, a unique thing out here.
Yeah, you're really getting on my nerves, actually, the more we talk. No, I'm just kidding. I wish we had that out here. As much as I've lived here my whole life, so I'm used to it. But I am not. I know a lot of people, they love fall or they love winter or snow or whatever. I like snow. That's about it. That's about all I like about cold weather. So I wouldn't mind Southern California weather for sure. So in addition to New Hope, you also work for the team at Ministry Architects. So tell us a little bit about Ministry Architects, what they do, maybe even how it got started, and how you all help churches.
Yeah, I met one of the vice presidents of Ministry Architects a couple years ago. I was speaking at a conference, ended up sharing lunch together at the airport on our way out of town. And as he started talking about Ministry Architects as a consulting firm, what they do, what they've done, what really resonated with me was coming onto a team of consultants that believed in two things in particular. Number one, that we need to be a group of people that help churches create systems of sustainability. And number two, they believed that every church is unique. And that was an exciting thing to know, that this consulting firm that started with one youth pastor, Mark DeVries, helping out his buddies in Tennessee, has grown to this organization that's helped over 1,000 churches across denominations, across the country, and that they take every assessment they do seriously. They make sure that the deliverable is handcrafted for that church, that it addresses the unique assets that they bring to the table, as well as the challenges that they're facing. And it's one of those things, like if there's a third thing that drew me to them, and I didn't know this till I was on the team, it really was that deliverable that we get to give churches on the back end of our visits with them. A church will bring us out to do an assessment of their current situation. Two consultants go together to make sure that when one is listening, the other one's typing, and that we're not missing anything along the way. Spend about 2 to 3 days with that church. And on the back end, we give each church an 18-month plan to work toward sustainability. And that plan's within the context of this 30-plus page document that we write up while we're on site. So church doesn't have to, A, wait to hear the results of how the visit went for any longer than we're there. And B, they don't have to wonder what their next steps are. And that is a neat thing to be able to give to a church. Not that other consulting firms do it wrong. We just do it different, where after those days, we're able to give them this hand-tailored plan to say, and here you go, gang. If you want sustainability, if you want to be able to reach your neighbors well, here's a plan. It starts this month. Here's 5 things to do. And then they work themselves through that 18-month plan of taking on 4 to 6 things a month that bring them towards that church that they want to be, and the ministry they want to have there.
That's good. And it got started. Did it get started just with youth ministry and group children's? And now is it all? I mean, it's comprehensive.
Right. So it's one of those things where Mark DeVries had written a book on family ministry, and his buddy started asking him, "Hey, could you help us do this at our church?" And he goes, "Sure." And so he helped a couple buddies out, and then started getting a workload that was a little too much for him to handle, and turned to one of his friends in ministry, Jeff, and was like, "Well, Jeff, if I could train you to do this, I could train anybody." And Jeff Dunrankin, he's one of our VPs, makes jokes about that all the time.
That's awesome.
And Jeff was able to, he was able to help that church find sustainability, and they went, I think this works. So then they started doing just youth ministry, right? Youth ministry. And as they found success there, some churches were like, well, could you do this for our kids? And Mark kind of went, probably, I think so. And, really found that so many of those systems that make a successful youth ministry sustainable are the same systems that in children's ministry can do the same. And so they began kind of translating some of those pieces over. About 5 years ago, it's when they really started bulking up the team with people who can speak specifically to children's ministry contexts. And that season is when I kind of came onto the team to help with some family ministry conversations. And yeah, at this point, we were youth ministry architects. We dropped the youth part because we said, we think the system pieces we have to coach churches through apply outside of just that youth ministry context and even outside of the children's ministry context. And so now we'll go into places, we'll do whole church assessments. There's a church out in Kansas that I was working with where we did some vision casting for the whole congregation to make sure they had a vision for where they were going that they felt good about, and then a plan to execute it. I mean, at our core really is this deliverable of, and what's next? Well, here you go. And if you work the plan works and it'll bring you towards sustainability and give you the church that you kind of wanted in the first place. We don't go in and rubber stamp and say, your church needs to be like our church. We really just ask, who do you want your church to be and how do we get there? And so, yeah, it's bigger than kids. It's bigger than youth at this point, though I'll still say that's our sweet spot, especially with the teams I go out with. That's what we're best at. But man, we're seeing some really cool things happen with young adult ministries, with small churches, and assessing that whole church. It's been a fun ride.
That's cool. And what I love about it, and of course I'm biased, is that you do focus on children's and student ministry as well. And I think it needs to be like overall church, because we all know how that works. You get in and try to help a student ministry and you realize, you know what, there's a lot here that's bigger than just this ministry. So really you need the whole church involved anyway. But there are a lot of, good church consulting organizations. I'm thinking of one in particular that I asked, the guy who started it about this, like the idea of, do you get a lot of requests for children's or youth ministry stuff? And he said no. And that didn't surprise me. And I thought, man, there's nothing, there's not much out there for that specifically. And there's so much that can be done to help the whole church if you start there. So that's really cool. That's why I'm excited about what you guys do. So a big question that comes up all the time that you all deal with, and you all, I would say Ministry Architects, one of the only organizations I know of that have some good numbers for this. But the question is staffing. Like, when is it time to hire staff? What are the ratios? How, do we have, when's there enough budget? When's there enough need based on how many kids we have or how many students? And I think most churches do this off of gut feeling, I guess would be the best way to say it.
Sure.
They're measuring it with everything else they got to hire for and just, it seems like, we have a lot and they need some help. That seems kind of the general approach. But talk about what Ministry Architects recommends for children's ministry in terms of staffing.
Yeah. One of the things we try to ask a church is, how many kids do you want to be able to care for? How many kids do you want to be able to pastor? How many families do you want to be able to provide care for? Just to let that hang before we then even start talking about numbers. Because for us, because we're an organization that cares a lot about sustainability, we know that you can actually run a children's ministry or youth ministry on less than ideal numbers of staff. We know you can, but our question back is that sustainable? And are you giving the best pastoral care to the families in your ministry? And so for us, when we look at children's ministries, we'll say you probably need a full-time staff for every 75 children in your ministry. Now, what'll happen sometimes is people go, well, my roster, all the kids that have visited in the last 5 years, that's a really long list. For us, it is that weekly average attendance of kids that we use as that metric. So your roles matter, absolutely. Your roster matters, absolutely. But don't take your number and go, well, and families only come once a month, so let me multiply it by 4. Wow, we need 10 staff to do this. It really is, for us, like all of the back-end analytics that we've run takes all of that into account to say, for every 75 kids who are attending your program weekly, your ministry weekly, you probably need a full-time staff to be able to care for the volunteers that it takes to then care for those kids and those families.
And so just to clarify, it could be full-time equivalent, right? You could have 2 20-hour people, roughly part-time, correct?
Absolutely.
75. So for somebody, if they're trying to figure out, especially if they have multiple staff and they're a bigger church, they have to figure out how many full-time equivalents do we have, right? By figuring out the hours and the full-time and part-time and then do the math that way. So, 300 kids, and if you had 3 full-time equivalents, which I guess would be 120 hours a week, right? If
Yep.
I'm doing the math off the top of my head. So you had 3 full-time equivalents. You have 1 full-time equivalent for every 100 kids. So you're a little bit higher than what you're recommending. That's good. That's helpful. And then,
Well, and
go
let
ahead.
me just add this. Like, you got to think through. I love that you brought up the full time equivalent piece. What children's pastors, children's directors, and this goes to the youth ministry side too. What they often underestimate is some of the administrative support that maybe they share with another department.
Yes.
Whether that's, hey, the worship team has, a guy who spends about 5 hours a week helping us in youth ministry. You got to factor those pieces in to discern what your span of care is. And if you're like, oh, but that's not where I want to be spending my staff hours, that's a good conversation to have then, to say, what we really need is this rather than that. Because it's not just people who have the title children's ministry in their title. It really is the staff support that helps the ministry run. You gotta factor those in too. So if you share a quarter admin with somebody else, you got to factor those hours in to that overall figure.
That's good. And even like our roles at our churches are kind of next gen pastor, family pastor. There's a portion of our time that technically applies to kids and students. And you got to figure out what is it? How do you carve it up? That's good. What about, I know this came up years ago. I think I'm going to do another one actually, and maybe even tie it with this podcast release, which would be helpful, I think. But I'd done a survey before to see what churches were, what the average church was staffing in terms of kids. And I'll probably do one for both. And interestingly enough, through that survey, it was 1 full-time equivalent for every 126 kids. But it wasn't, I didn't have enough survey responses that it was, I felt really good about it. So I'd love to do it again. But I know one thing I ran into trying to ask people the right questions, to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, was it's very different to staff for a weekly Sunday morning program for kids that happens during services, and that's all you do, versus the church that's doing Wednesday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night, and they're trying to staff all of them. Do you all take that into consideration, or how does that work? Because you're talking about the same staff hours just getting spread out over more things.
Yeah, so what we try to do, and we'll do this all on the front end before we even get on site with the church, we'll ask them, hey, list out your programs, list out your attendance numbers, but then let's talk through your unique kids in each one, right? So let's say you have a Sunday program of 60 kids and you have a midweek program of 40, right? Because let's say that's how that works. But your 40 kids are different than those 60 kids. You might have a 5-kid overlay. Well, then we're actually talking about the pastoral support and care for about 95 kids. So you got to add those together. So you don't add the numbers completely, but it is unique, right? So you got to look for where that overlap happens, pull those kids, you don't double count anybody, but you got to make sure you're doing that. So if you're a church that at one point, the church I was at in Los Angeles, we were running our Sunday stuff. We had Saturday night service. We had 3 Sunday morning services. We did a Wednesday night thing, but then we were also running after school programs in 4 of the 5 elementary schools in our district. Those were happening on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. So literally the only program day we weren't staffing in children's ministry was Fridays, but then the women's ministry ran a women's ministry thing that they needed childcare for. So we had individual kind of, kids on every single day of the week. And I'll just tell you right now, when you look at the staffing we had, it wasn't sustainable because of what it would actually take to staff that well, because those were unique kids across all of those. One of our school programs had 200 kids in it. We weren't going to be able to pastorally care for those kids without hiring somebody to really take that on, and even a couple people. And so that could have given us the chance as a team to say, what do we want to do? And really the choice is yours. Do we want to understaff all of these programs we're doing, or do we want to do less programs? But we need to decide, or do we want to just hire on 3 more people to provide pastoral care for everyone we're looking at? What I find is these numbers, Nick, they give you the right questions to ask. They don't always provide the answers, but they give you the right questions to ask.
Yeah, and they probably give you a better picture of reality too, right? Like, because it's easy in children's and student ministry to feel understaffed, and I doubt anybody ever feels overstaffed. I think I asked that question on the survey, and a few people put it, but most people said just right, just right on staff or understaffed. Whereas at least these numbers, these benchmarks give you a little bit more objective data about where we are that you can even compare with other churches, which I think is helpful. Because otherwise, again, it's back to gut feeling, and that can just not be a good gauge sometimes.
Yeah, and I'll say, the more churches we work with, the more this number is confirmed. And again, we've worked with almost 1,000 churches now, and this is across denominations. I was out down in Florida with this sweet Episcopal church a couple weeks ago. I've been working with some Methodist churches across the Midwest, have some fun Presbyterian friends out on the West Coast. And so these numbers, they really do cross denominational lines, because it is just asking, it's really how many kids and families can be supported by one staff member. And for us, we really feel like that 75 number is that number in children's ministry for us to say, that's about where you're at. Ministry is always going to be tiring because work is hard. Like if you're doing work right, work is hard sometimes. And so asking your team, and you hit this, asking your team, do we have enough people? Well, we're always tired, right? So if we just leave it up to feelings, we're going to say, oh, we need more people. When in reality, maybe you just need better systems, because you might actually have enough staff. You're just not using them the right way, or, ministry's hard. And so you're just looking at yourself and going, this week was hard. Maybe more staff would answer that one.
Yeah, I know the other thing that our staff has been looking at the past year too, that I think a lot of churches need to look at is, are we doing too many things within the ministry? So I'm not talking about, we have, 50 ministries, though that would be a problem too. But within one ministry, are we doing some non-essential things that, we're just not getting the return on our investment from? So therefore, it feels even more understaffed because we're doing all this other stuff, and they're good things, but are they the best things? They really get us the big return. And having these benchmarks could let you know, okay, so we feel like really overworked, but yet, according to these numbers, we're well staffed. Something else might be wrong. I think that's helpful.
Yep.
That's good. What is it for student ministry, youth ministry?
Yeah, so that number is actually a little bit smaller in youth ministry. We suggest a one full-time staff equivalent for every 50 kids in your youth ministry. Now, when we're talking kids and youth, this is helpful to think through. That sixth grade line, depending on your school district, could either fall into children's ministry or can fall into youth ministry. And I've even seen youth ministries, Nick, where the preteen ministry, the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders are actually under that youth ministry umbrella. But what we find is whether you split that 6th grade group on one side or the other, the way you run your ministry is different. And so then the perceived needs of those families then becomes slightly different. And so wherever you draw the line, that doesn't change this number. And it's one full-time staff equivalent for every 50 kids.
And I would imagine a lot of, I don't know, I'd love to hear what you say, but it seems to me like that's an area where there's probably more likely to be understaffed. I don't see a lot of youth ministries having, 2 full-time equivalents for 100 students, but maybe it's more in children's. I see it on both sides, but it's hard for me I can think of some churches that have, that level of children's staffing, not so much on the student side. What do you see? Is it kind of even?
Yeah, it's funny. We'll go out to church and it almost feels like a coin flip of, are they going to be over or understaffed? Now they're all going to feel understaffed every time. I'll tell you,
we need help.
Part of our meetings when we're on site, we'll meet specifically with the family ministry team, whatever that looks like. We'll meet with the rest of the staff just to hear their input on, what is a healthy kids ministry, what is a healthy youth ministry, because whatever we give as a deliverable, everybody's got to own to move forward. And so we bring all the voices in, and you'll often find without the children's and youth ministry teams in the room, the rest of the staff will say, oh, they're overstaffed. And again, this is regardless of whether they are or are not. They'll feel like they have too many staff.
Yeah.
And then you ask the kids or youth ministry teams whether they're together or separate, and they'll say, oh, I wish we had more staff. And so feelings can be a little murky on that one. So you just got to look at the raw data. And for us, it really is this coin flip of they're going to be or they're not going to be. It's almost a 50-50 split, even though they all feel like they're understaffed.
That's interesting to know that roughly half the ones you work with are overstaffed or at least adequately staffed, because sometimes it would seem like it might be the opposite. You know what I mean?
Yep. Now, what we try to stay away from is the word overstaffed. We just talk about, you have the potential to reach this many kids. You have you have this much more room for growth before you get there. Because we don't want to go into a place and use the term overstaffed on accident in a conversation and leave and have the church go, well, let's lay off that guy.
Yeah, you're fired.
The consultants told us to. That wouldn't be good. Like, that wouldn't give us a lot of fans out there. Now, there are times when we have gone out to places to say, just had some real honest conversations with senior leadership to go, you're staffed for 150 students to come to your ministry. You're a church of 150. Those ratios aren't going to play out. Like, you probably need to reassign some roles here. If you love all these people that are on the bus, you're probably just going to need to find some extra seats for them. If you love having them on your team, because you got to look at what's the realistic expectation of how many kids or students you're going to have involved in your ministry to then be able to staff that number.
That's a good point too, because there's a church around here. I actually just in the last few weeks pointed them to you all for this exact reason. They've gone through a lot of staff change. In my view, using your numbers, they were overstaffed in both areas, children's and students. However, I think a lot of it was because they weren't reaching the number of kids and students that you typically would for a church their size.
Yeah,
especially on the student side. So part of it was like, well, I mean, if the ratios of students and kids to the total attendance of the church was closer to normal, they probably would be fine, but they're not. And now they ended up having a lot of staff turnover for some other reasons. So I think they now have the opportunity to sort of start from scratch, and now they're understaffed, because it went from over to under real quick. Yep. But I think that's helpful to know, to talk about, well, where do you want to be? And because if you do have more staff than you need, that could be the step could be, I'm guessing, let's try to, grow this ministry to the potential that we now have because of staff. So I could see that happening. I think that would be helpful. Is that something you coach churches to do? How do we you have the right staff? How do we get you from where you are in the ministry to where it should be?
Absolutely. And again, we're going to use that, the size of the congregation, the size of the worshiping adults on a Sunday to determine metrics of, so what's realistic? And super important to bring senior leadership into that. We find that churches that don't name a number, a target, are actually those ministries, and more so in the youth, but also in children's, those ministries are actually graded more harshly on numbers if they don't name it up front for here's where we're going, and get everybody to buy into that number. So if you're a church of 500 and you're like, hey, we need 100 kids in our youth ministry. Number one, that's going to be pushing some sustainability limits we could talk about in a bit. But number two, we're going to say, okay, so do we all agree? Is that a target we're going to go for? Okay, let's go for it. Now, the same church, same size, doesn't name the number of kids that they want to have in the youth group. They don't know what number to celebrate. They don't know how close they are. They don't know, gosh, we really, we have a really strong 8th grade class, but we're weak on the rest of the areas. What do we do specifically to target sophomores? How do we go after that? If you're not being intentional about what numbers we're trying to target and how do we get there? And that's one of the things we try to come in and help churches identify. Where do you want to go? And let's lay out the groundwork over the next 18 months of how to get there. Let's take a deep breath. I know that change doesn't happen overnight, but let's get there one step at a time.
So what I know I've had numbers I've used for a long time, and some of them have been confirmed with other surveys I see or whatever. But what numbers do you use as a gauge for roughly how many kids should be attending this church, how many students? And we can talk about the uniquenesses of church and context. But generally speaking, do you have numbers there that you say, I know we always say we shoot for 10% of our total attendance as students, and we just know from history that 24% roughly of our attendance is kids.
Yeah. So what we've found, and this is working with all the churches we've worked with, and then I see it play out time and time again, is if you're at about 10% youth, you named it. If you're at 10% youth, you're healthy. For every percentage point under that, you probably have some room to grow. If you're under 5%, and we just name this to churches, like your church is probably dying. And that's not to say like the youth ministries that no, like let's talk about holistically, like the next generation raising up in your church. If you're under 5%, like we gotta determine that's not just hey, let's go for annual checkup to the doctor. That's no, let's get into ICU. There's some bleeding we got to stop because something's wrong under that 5% number. And then we start saying, you're going to see in youth ministry, the 20% number is really we try to not use the terminology, it's a hard cap. But I will say that it's hard to see churches run a sustainable youth ministry at 20% or over. 10% is healthy. 15% is, wow, they're kicking, they're doing great. The closer you push up to 20% of the youth, the numbers in your church are youth, that just starts pushing sustainability stuff when you start talking about budgeting, where the volunteer is going to come from, what staff is it going to take to be able to pull this off. You start pushing dangerous. On the kids side, we find that 15% is actually pretty healthy. You're naming 24. That's fantastic. We find that churches that are about 15%, that's actually good. For every percentage point under 10% when it comes to children's ministry, you're actually pushing towards, that church might be on its way towards dying. And there's some triage things we're going to have to do to get in there to try to fix some of that. As you start pushing over 20% in children's ministry, you start pushing towards unsustainability. The amount of volunteers, the amount of program dollars you're going to have to throw towards it, and staffing dollars, you start really kind of pressing the church towards some unhealthy places to be able to sustain a ministry that size. And I will put some cards on the table. One of our campuses right now is actually at about 34%. And if you ask,
that's huge.
But here's the thing: if you ask the staff or the volunteers there, they are wearing themselves out to keep that pace. It's not a healthy pace. It's a number that, in a vacuum, man, senior leadership would love to celebrate, to go like, oh, this is amazing. Because right now, the darling in kind of church world, coast to coast, is family ministries. And a lot of churches are measuring their health of their church on that number. And in true kind of American Western fashion, bigger's better. And so, gosh, 34, that's amazing. One of our jobs is to come in as consultants to go, well, actually, 34 is not amazing. Let's look at what you're doing holistically as a church, where you're missing out on parents of young adults. We used to call them empty nesters. The nests aren't really empty anymore because you have so many young adults moving back home. But what is your church doing to reach out to that demographic? Because those are going to be people that sustain you when it comes to funding and when it comes to volunteers. If all you have in your church is young families, not only are you lacking kind of the wisdom side of things to move that church forward, but just the nuts and bolts of funding and volunteer numbers to be able to do that. Because if you're a church where 25% are kids and you're pushing another 15% are students, gosh, real quick, you just got up to 40% of your church is under the age of 18. So 40% of your church, when we're talking about them tithing, like their giving potential there's a certain ceiling there. And when you're talking about, how many people from your church are going to then need to be volunteering in the ministry, you now don't have volunteers to do local outreach. You don't have volunteers to do a worship ministry because everybody at that point has to be involved in your kids and students. And so for us, those ceilings, and we're careful with that word. So anybody listening, that's not, when you hit the ceiling, it won't grow past that. It can, but when you're talking about sustainability, that's about 20% in youth. If you're pushing past that, you got to ask some good questions there about how do we balance this thing out. And when you're pushing over 20% and that 25%, you're right there. If you're at 24, if you grew much more only in kids, you're going to wear out your staff, you're going to wear out your volunteers, and you're not going to move towards health. You're actually going to move more towards unhealth just as that system keeps spiraling.
That makes sense. So it's 20% is the ceiling for students, 25%, is that what you said for kids?
Yeah, but even, I'll say, I start, when I'm talking to churches, if they're over 20%, when we're trying to gauge enthusiasm, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we start talking about paying the rent for change. When you talk about enthusiasm, the more you push past 20%, you start having more people who are tired versus excited. You'll still have some excited people, but you'll also have more tired people for every percentage point you push past 20 in a congregation, unless your youth numbers aren't towards their ceiling. Because then maybe those volunteers who could be serving in youth are actually serving in upper elementary. That funding that could be going towards youth that was pushing its ceiling can balance you over in kids. So you got to look holistically, cradle to college, for what those numbers are. But generally, that's how they play out.
Sure, that makes sense. And because, like, again, what you're talking about is there's just limited resources. There's limited money and limited people. And so if a high percentage of your attendance is kids and students, that means less people serving, like you said, less people, giving to support it. That makes sense. We, our number's probably where it is. Mostly it started at 15 when we launched the church 10 years ago. But I think most of it's just been the age of the church. Our pastor was 35 when we launched the church. And so now he's 46. So maybe he was 36 then. So, you typically reach the generation behind your pastor. And so that's where we are. So it just makes sense that, and I would say every year for the first 8 years of our church, that percentage of kids and students kept rising. And I think it's just because the average age of our church, kept rising. But I feel like we have, in the last few years, hit that ceiling, which is okay. According to what you're saying, that might be we've hit sustainability, which is probably a good thing. At this point, the whole church should grow, not just kids, because for a while, kids outpaced the church. It would grow double. And I think it, again, was just the mix. We were reaching a lot of families more so than, singles, empty nesters, that kind of thing. So that's helpful.
Well, and I've just seen, even from personal experience, the last church I was at when I came on staff, generally churches make hires when there's a need, right? So anybody, like if you just came into a church, you're like, oh gosh, there's some broken things. Yeah, no, they hired you because there was a need. So when I came on at the last place, we were at about 8% kids to adults. By the time I left, we were actually closer to 24, 25%. And so much of that had to do with, senior pastor and, the vision that he was putting forth. But I'll tell you, the sweet spot for change, when it was easiest for me to make change, was actually when that ministry was just under 15%. So any listeners that are sitting there going, gosh, I need to get up to 20% in order for my senior leadership to believe in, change needs to happen, or, I need more staffing, or I need something. It was easiest for me in my context to institute change when we were closer to that 15% number, because not everybody was happy. I mean, it's church world. Like, not everybody's going to be happy all the time. Like, welcome to life. But that's when I had the best enthusiasm in my volunteers, the best enthusiasm in my staff, because we were most sustainable in those numbers, and it was the easiest season to institute change. So if you're in a church and you're thinking, I got to get bigger to do that, actually, no, you need to be sustainable in order to institute some of those changes you want to make.
So in addition to staffing, there's two other big things you all talk about, and you mentioned paying the rent, and it's volunteers and budget. So how do they relate, and how do you kind of use all of that together to evaluate sustainability?
Yeah, that's good. So again, we're talking span of care. And so that span of care for staffing is, 50, you can care for 50 students well for every full-time equivalent staff member you have in your student ministry, 75 for kids. When we start talking about span of care at the volunteer level, we'll ask, so for however many kids you have, for every 5 kids, you should have 1 volunteer. And here's the thing, Nick, and this is where we found some similarities between students and children's ministry. That number is actually the same. It's 1 to 5. Now, as somebody who has overseen children's teams, my nursery is going to look at me and go, "Wait, one person can't hold 5 babies." I get it. Like you can't. Because even if you had 2 in each arm and you're, bouncing some bouncy chairs with each foot, you literally still have 1 more kid. Like, what do you do with them? And no new mom's going to drop their kid off into a room where the ratio is 1 to 5 in the nursery. But at the same time, at your 4th and 5th grade level, you can actually bump some of those those numbers up. Now, a 1 to 5 ratio is amazing if you're talking about small groups, life groups. Like, man, that's great for those kids to dive deep into those conversations. But sustainability wise, 1 to 5 is where we land there. And same thing in students, you just lay your volunteer plan out differently. And so if you're a children's ministry with 50 kids, we're going to say, okay, you should probably have about 10, and this is full-time equivalent. So 10 volunteers running the ministry. Now, if you're an every other week serving model, you're actually going to need 20. If you're a once a month serving model, you're going to need 40, because it's an easy number to measure. And it's something that when I came on staff here, we really started getting into the nuts and bolts of, hey, so what are our kids' numbers? and how many volunteers did we have today? And what does that look at that 1-to-5 ratio? Are we sustainable, or are we letting families down? Are we not able to provide the care that we need to be giving right now because of our volunteer numbers?
I think that helps too, that you clarified that if they serve every other week, you do have to double it. So the 1-to-5, because I know, for instance, I know our ratio for both. And however, it doesn't really factor in that there's a small percentage of preschool volunteers. So in our church, age 3.5 roughly on up is weekly small group leaders. But younger than that, there are weekly leaders in preschool, but there are also some that do every other. So it's a kind of a mix. So there's not a huge percentage of that in our church, which is probably why it doesn't affect the numbers that much. But what you're saying is you almost count them like a half, I guess, a person, right? Or some churches they serve once every 4 weeks.
They do. Well, and especially, if you're talking about a church that they only have one service, right? And that's actually majority of churches out there, they're doing one worship service a weekend. If you're asking your volunteers to serve every week, well, they're not really a part of your congregation anymore. They're a part of the children's church that now operates as kind of this like one-eared Mickey Mouse that has some connection to the church, but really is its own like parachurch organization. So you almost have to figure out a way for your volunteers to serve every other week, if not once a month in that setting. And at that point, you're then doubling your volunteer needs, because for every 5 kids who are attending your program, you need to have 1 volunteer present. And that's not a safety guideline. That's not again, you don't use that number in your nursery. That really is just a metric we use to say, what's the span of care that you can give to your families? If you have 20 volunteers on a weekend, cool. That means you can care for about 100 kids. And if you're at 140, your volunteers are going to feel that stretch, and it's going to be hard for them to invite their friends into serving in that context, because nobody wants to bring their friend to a bad party. Nobody wants to invite their friend into something that they don't enjoy doing. And so when you push past that sustainability piece, you're also impacting your recruiting ability to be able to have volunteers invite friends into serving alongside them.
And that's, I think the way you said it too is helpful, that it's 1-to-5 there in the environment to help provide care. That's another way to think about it, is not just who's on the roster as volunteer, but how many do we have there in the environment, with the number of kids that we have in the environment. That's good. What about budget? How does budget work into this?
Yep. So every community is going to be slightly different, right? So I'm going to use a number, and you're going to go, wait, is that a California number? Is that where does that number come from?
What's the average income, household income, or whatever?
Yeah. So when we get feet on the ground in a community as consultants, like we can run all those metrics and go, okay, here's where that's at. But I'll tell you, I'm going to use the national average number, right? So for every church that's under this, you're going to have a church that's over this. And for every community that's kind of middle of the road, this is about where you're going to be. And this number is the same in children's ministry as it is in student ministry. And I have youth pastors sometimes that go, wait, our budget should be the same. This actually isn't just program dollars. This is staffing dollars as well. So if you're at a church and you're trying to figure out your budget for next year, you actually need to know, whoever's in charge of the budget needs to know, well, how many staffing dollars are we putting towards the ministry? Because that's going to impact the amount of program dollars you have in order to do, a sustainable model of care for kids in your ministry. And that number is about $1,000 per kid for the year. And for some people, like that sounds like a lot. Like it sounds like
100 kids, $100,000 a year total, though.
But you got to figure out, okay, what are the staffing dollars we're putting towards that? And then from that, figure out where are the program dollars. And I was just having this conversation with my student pastor here where I'm at yesterday. We're in my office. I got whiteboards everywhere because that's how I think. And we're doing budget stuff for this next year. We're finalizing those numbers because we sit down with our finance team on Monday to make that pitch. And we're going, gosh, we really need to increase our program dollars, but it'd be great to add a staff member. Where do we go with that? And, kind of figuring out, well, if we add a staff member, that's going to be this many tens of thousands of dollars. Would we be better served by adding that, or adding that number to our program budget if we're going to make a pitch for that? Because you don't get to do both. You really need to decide, where do we want those dollars spent? Because it all impacts that number. So $1,000 per kid, $1,000 per student, and that's program and staffing dollars. And that gives you a sense of your span of care for your ministry. And so if you're running a ministry for 100 kids on $60,000 staffing and program, you just need to know that there's probably about 40 kids in your ministry that you're not caring for as well as you could be. And as a church, if you're going to say, in this season, that's kind of where we have to be, then that's okay. Like you just need to be able to make that decision. And then, when I go places, they'll ask me the same thing you asked with staffing, right? Well, majority of churches, are they then understaffed or overstaffed with that number? It's literally the same thing that we find, is that often kids and youth ministries feel underfunded. But when we go in and we run the numbers, about half are, but half are over. And it's one of those things where when we get down and we sit down with them, we talk through the staffing dollars that are being spent and the program dollars. We'll actually say, you have a span of care where you could have 20 more kids and you'd be okay. Let's talk about where you're spending your dollars, right? So if you feel like you're underfunded, maybe it's just a budgeting issue of where those dollars are going versus what you can actually do with those dollars.
That's good. And it's helpful, I think, because you put all that together. And I remember in the Sustainable Youth Ministry book, it talks about you really don't want to be weak if in those three areas, staff, volunteers, budget. You really want to be strong in two of them if you're going to be weak in a third. And it's kind of like what you're talking about. If you're not going to spend it on staffing, okay, then can you spend it in the program itself? And it's limited resources, so somehow you're dividing it up. Is there, just from your experience, is there a way that you've seen dividing it up be usually into better results? Meaning, like, okay, if we can spend this on staffing or the program, in my history, I've seen where it goes a lot further if we spend it on staffing, or vice versa. Or has it really just been case by case?
So everything's going to be case by case, right? Like, so I'm going to give an answer, and if you're listening and you go, then that's what we got to do. Yeah, actually, you got to be careful there. But I will say that often churches are better served if they actually do the staff piece kind of after the volunteer piece, and they actually increase the budget last. And that's, when you're talking about those three areas, volunteer, staffing, and then, finances, the dollars, we're really going to go, hey, if you don't have the right volunteers in place, if you don't have the ability to, hands and feet care for the kids or students that God has given you, man, put your energy there first. And you can recruit volunteers into a ministry that is underfunded. Like your ability to care for those kids with hands and feet go a lot further than the cool toys you can put in the room. They just do. Now, I'm not saying those things don't matter. But if we're talking which one goes, which one stays, and I'll say this, staffing, even having the volunteers in place to get the ministry done matters a little bit more than hiring your next staff person. If you know that you're going to need to hire staff, you should be the one recruiting the volunteers for them to inherit, knowing that some of them they said yes to you. They didn't say yes to that new staff member. And so that new staff member is going to have to take that team and figure out who's going to say yes to them and who's not, and who's going to stick. But when you hire on a new staff member and expect them to recruit volunteers, they don't have any relational capital in that congregation yet. They don't know the people. So their ask doesn't go as far as your ask. So if you can do the asks on the front end, that matters more. And then for the churches I've seen, doing that program dollar increase or whatever last is actually sometimes what you have to do. But the staffing and the program dollars, they really tie in. And I hope that I said that well earlier, that you got to figure both those numbers in to go, how close are we to be able to fund the ministry for the amount of kids we have, not just today, but the amount we want to have tomorrow. And so asking senior leadership, how many kids do we want to see in our program? Okay, well, with that number, if we want to see 100 kids, we need to be spending about $100,000 on that. where do we want that to go as far as staffing and program dollars? Do we want to be spending $70,000 a year on 2 staff members? Well, then that gives us about $30,000 program dollars to be able to care for those kids. Is that where we want it to go? And these numbers, they don't always give you the right answer, but they help you ask the right questions. And it really is up to you as a leadership team and really at the congregational level to decide, where do we want to spend it? Where do we want to go and get everybody bought into that vision?
Yeah. And so everybody listening, they're obviously, I hope what they're going to do is they're going to figure out their numbers, right? They're going to figure out their ratios of staff, figure out the ratios of volunteers, figure out their budget and work all that together. And what you're saying is, especially if you can kind of improve in all 3 areas, but really start with volunteers, try to build that up. That makes total sense because like you're saying, you can recruit and make it better for whoever you're going to hire. I don't know if we think that way though. It seems like most churches think the other way. Let's hire someone to fix it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where we often have to go into churches and remind them. So the staff is not the Messiah. Jesus is. Like, hiring a new staff person is not going to rescue everything. But so often that's what we do is we hire a staff member in to a place with broken systems. Well, they don't have the relational capital to actually address those systems. And so after 12 to 18 months, we go, staff member hasn't fixed the systems. Let's hire a new one. And we transition that person out and we bring a new person in, and we never address the systems. One of the word pictures we use as a consulting firm is one of a dance floor. And this is in Mark's book, Sustainable Youth Ministry, where he talks about, you have this beautiful dance floor and the dancer is on it, and the dancer kind of crashes through this weak spot in the floor. We didn't quite support that part of the stage well. They crash through, and we go, oh, that's such a shame. Stupid dancer. Get rid of the dancer. Bring in somebody new. Now there's literally a hole in the floor, and then you could bring in somebody from Juilliard. You could bring in the best dancer in the world, and if they're mid leap and they realize they're coming down into that hole, there's nothing they could do. They're going to crash through it. And churches then often go, gosh, stupid dancer, like, come on. And we leave these holes in our systems that any staff person is going to fall through because we haven't done the work in between staff transitions to really make those systems sustainable so the staff member can come in and dance on a floor that is solid. It's real hard to ask that dancer to fix the floor mid-routine, but it's so often what we do. So one of the things we try to come in, a church will bring us in often in a staff transition because they'll go, well, we were spending that many dollars on a staff member. Gosh, ministry architects is real affordable. Let's just bring them in instead of paying a staff member this month because that actually costs less. We'll do that. And when we come in, we often have to pump the brakes and go, hey, before you hire the next person, here's some systems. Let's address that over the next 30 to 60 days. Let's make sure all of our volunteers have background checks done so the new staff member doesn't have to come in and go, hey, so apparently some of you might be people that harm children. So, hey, fill out this thing. Give me your social security number. That's a big ask for a new staff person and doesn't help build trust moving forward. So as much as you can, systems first, staff second. And then you really just got to figure out, do we want those to be program dollars? Do we want them to be staffing dollars when you're looking at $1,000 a kid number?
Yeah, that's helpful. And as you're talking through that, I'm thinking that is actually, without really knowing it, how our student ministry grew from, I would describe as unhealth to health, because there was a time when our student ministry was about 6%. And some of that was age of the church, because, again, we were younger at the time. Our pastor would have been around 40. And so there weren't as many families, but we knew they were there. So sometimes you just know your church, and there's students here, and we're just not reaching them well. And, as I think back, we did fix it, not necessarily because we knew. I think it was the only option, with volunteers, better systems, and then more staff, and then more money. So that's interesting. But we had no idea. It was like, well, we can only fix it with volunteers right now because, and the existing staff, but that's all we had. It's like, okay, let's try this thing out. And now it's in it's in a lot better place.
Well, and, so many churches, they'll hear numbers like this and they go, we got to change things tomorrow. That's fantastic. And one of the things I try to pump the brakes on and say, well, before you try to institute change, let's make sure you're paying the rent. Before you buy a new sofa, let's make sure you have a roof over your head. And that makes sense for those of us who are grown-ups who either pay a mortgage or pay a rent. Like, you have to have a roof over your head before you start buying a new flat screen. You should, if you're being wise.
Yeah, that would be smart.
Let's get the roof over our head first. And so for us, as a consulting firm, we've determined there's 3 rents that need to be paid in any ministry in order for you to have enough change in your pocket to make change happen. And so it's one of those things, you got to pay the rent before you expect to get paid. You got to be making sure you're good on your numbers, you're good on your programs, and you're good on enthusiasm. And what I mean by that with numbers, are you seeing 10% students if you're talking about student ministries? If not, it's going to be hard to ask for change to happen if you're not paying the rent there. In kids ministry, are you at 15%? If you're not, it's not impossible, but it's going to be hard to make change happen if you're under that number. But there's 3 areas, right? So if you're like, well, I'm under there, well, here's what you can do. You can address these next 2. The one is programs. So if I went into your church and I asked, hey, what programs do you have for kids ministry? What if I have, because I have a preschool, I have 2 elementary age kids, what kind of programs do you have? And I'm not asking the staff. I'm asking families in the church, and a family doesn't have to have kids in the home. Family could be a single person, but I'm asking people in the church, what programs do you have? If people don't have a quick answer of, oh, here's what we have, well, it's going to be really hard for you to ask for more dollars for something that people don't know what you're spending the dollars on. And so do you have programs in your church that everyone knows this is what we have? And if not, that's something you could do before you throw dollars at it. And that's even something you could do if you have 6% youth, is you just help start rolling out this vision of, here's what we have for students, so that everybody knows, hey, we have this awesome youth retreat coming up. So everyone, it just has a sense of, well, I know every summer we do VBS. Cool. Great. What else do you do? Well, I know we have Sunday school. Fantastic. You and I, Nick, we could talk about branding of VBS and Sunday school in a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
But it's going to be hard to ask for more dollars if people don't know what the dollars are going towards. And then the last one is enthusiasm. If I ask people who are involved in your ministry, what words would you use to describe the ministry? If they're using positive words versus negative words, it's going to go a long way. If you have negative words that people are using, if enthusiasm is down, if you're not paying the rent in that area, and it starts with you as a leader. If you're walking around saying, gosh, we don't have enough staff. Oh, I wish we had more dollars. Oh, our attendance is low. If your enthusiasm is up, you're never going to be able to raise that bar of enthusiasm among your volunteers. They're never going to be able to raise the bar of enthusiasm on the kids or students you serve. And they're never going to be able to translate that enthusiasm out to their parents, who then at the congregational level won't be able to translate that enthusiasm out. And so start with you. Where's my enthusiasm? Like, how excited am I right now, scale of 1 to 10? And what can I do to lead myself into an area where I can be excited about the ministries God's called me to? And out of that, lead your volunteers. And out of that, translate that down to kids and students. And out of that, how do we then translate that out to families and out to the congregation? Those are all things you can do without dollars. And if you're paying the rent in programs and enthusiasm, your attendance numbers can actually be down a little bit. And if you have 2 out of the 3, you start being able to institute change in some really cool ways. That'll lead you towards a place where you have sustainable numbers.
Yeah, and you mean too, because if you pay the rent there, then you have more to stand on when you ask for more help or more money or whatever it might be, right?
Yep, because if everyone knows, well, those are the programs we're doing, those are good. Everyone's excited about the ministry. Yeah, we could probably, and gosh, our numbers are healthy. Yeah, we need to be able to reach more kids. If you have a bad product, saying we want to reach more kids with a bad product is hard to sell to any elder board or senior leadership team. If, hey, come over to the grocery store, the bread is moldy and we want to give more moldy bread to more people. Like, that's just a hard sell. Let's make sure what we have on the shelf is something that everybody wants. So then when we ask for more funds or more staffing to share what we have with more people, everybody's on board with that because they're excited about what you have to offer.
Well, this has been really, really awesome. We'll put all this in the show notes. It'll probably be the longest show notes ever because I think I'll want to include, the metrics and the benchmarks and the calculations and even the 3 rents, because it sounds like that's how you can walk through it, figure out where you are and all that. But obviously, some people are going to want to get in touch with you or ministry architects, or you might have another question or something like that. So how could they reach out? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, best way to get us is actually just going on to our website, ministryarchitects.com. We have some kind of freebie things that are on there that anybody could use. There's ways to get a hold of staff members. I tell people all the time, being a ministry friend is free, right? So if you just want to find me on Facebook, facebook.com/my name, Anthony Prince, let's be friends there. Let's start a conversation. I'm on Twitter. The only difference is there's an underscore between my first and last name, Anthony_Prince on Twitter. Let's start a conversation. Let's be friends. That costs $0. Let's do that. If we need to move into a place where we're doing phone coaching, or if you want to bring us on site, out of the consulting firms I know, it's been hard for me to find one that's more reasonably priced for the deliverable we have. But all of that's on our website, ministryarchitects.com, and we can go from there.
That's awesome. Well, Anthony, thanks again. This has been really, really helpful. It's pretty unique, and I know people are going to love this and be helped by this. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
I really like that concept of paying rent. I just think it's good. It's a good reminder for us to do the best we can with what we have before we ask for more. So there are a number of action items coming out of this interview, but I'm just giving you one selfishly. I'd love for you to take that survey. Now, taking that survey means you'll think about your numbers and your ratios, and I think that's the best thing you can take away from this conversation is take the benchmarks that we talked about, figure out what it is at your church, and see where you're over, under, especially looking at all three things, budget, staff, and volunteers, and figure out where you are with each one. And then kind of like he talked about, maybe start with volunteers if you're under on a few of them and you got to build yourself up. But I'd love for you to take that survey. Again, you can get it from the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 28. And I'll probably leave that open for about 3 weeks or so, and we'll see what results we get. And it'll be interesting because it'll be something we can always come back to and compare to, figure out what other churches that are similar to yours experience and things like that would be really helpful. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. In the next episode, I talk with Jeff Reed of Lifeway Kids, and we talk about different approaches to discipleship in children's ministry, particularly like what we've seen, over the past few decades and like where it's heading now. He feels like this idea of having a gospel-centered children's ministry is really taking root, and they have a curriculum specifically designed for that called the Gospel Project, which is growing in popularity tremendously. And I don't know if it is yet, but assume will be their most popular children's curriculum at Lifeway. And so we talk about that approach, and how it's impacting children's ministry. And even some of that conversation about gospel-centered totally impacts student ministry too. So, if that's where you serve, I'd encourage you to listen to that episode as well. But that's next week. So be sure to subscribe. Leave a rating and a review on iTunes if you can. That'd be great. Helps get in front of the people. I always appreciate that. But thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.